For those of you just joining us now, my name is Luke Evnan, and I'm the chair of the Scleroderma Research Foundation. These next two sessions will take us through an introduction in how drugs progress through clinical trials and how our community can participate in the development of better therapies. Also, we'll have an opportunity to learn about Conquest, a transformative innovation in the clinical development of new drugs in scleroderma that has been created through the efforts of the Scleroderma Research Foundation. Now, I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Peter Merkel, who will cover clinical trials, a patient's guide. But let me introduce Peter in a bit more detail. Dr. Merkel is chair of rheumatology and professor of medicine and epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Penn Scleroderma Center. Dr. Merkel is an internationally recognized researcher and clinical expert in scleroderma and is an author on over 400 scientific publications. Dr. Merkel's research focuses on clinical trial design and conduct, outcome measure development, clinical epidemiology, genetic epidemiology, and biomarker discovery. Dr. Merkel received his MD from Yale University and his Master of Public Health from Harvard. He completed his residency at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania and completed his fellowship at the MGH Hospital at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Merkel has received the majority of his research support from the NIH, the US FDA, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and he has received some additional funding from a variety of industry sources as well as private foundations. Dr. Merkel is highly active in the scleroderma research community. He's a member of the Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium, and together with Dr. Dinesh Khanna, Dr. Merkel is leading an NIH and SCTC-sponsored effort to improve research to develop new treatments for scleroderma by formally assessing the outcome measures used in clinical trials. And with that, I'll hand it over to Peter, and thank you.
Hi, I am Dr. Peter Merkel. I'm a rheumatologist at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Penn Scleroderma Center, and I've been studying scleroderma, taking care of patients with scleroderma for over 25 years, including conducting clinical trials in this disease and others. And I've been asked today to talk about the essentials of clinical trials, a patient's guide, and I'm delighted to be part of the SRF Patient Forum and work once again with the Scleroderma Research Foundation. Let me start by saying, why should someone participate in clinical research in scleroderma? Why would you volunteer? Well, there's some good reasons, and I'll talk about those. I think these are the top 5 reasons. Number 5, rare diseases are hard to study without dedicated volunteer subjects. We need people to volunteer so we can get the data to help improve the lives of patients with scleroderma. 4, participation in research studies is empowering. It's interesting to be part of a trial and helps you say you're helping to take care of yourself and others in the future, hopefully by learning more information. Top 3 reason, participation in research studies is interesting. You really understand how we start thinking about these diseases, especially our clinical trials, why are they so complicated, and you learn more about your own disease. Participation may help others in the future. This is an important reason to do it because we can gain data that will help us understand more about the disease and perhaps how to treat it better. And perhaps the best reason, or one of the top reasons, is to help advance understanding of the pathophysiology, which means what causes scleroderma and how to best treat scleroderma. Now, not every study will answer all these questions, but only through properly conducted studies can we have good science, and that good science will advance our care for patients. So those are some of the very good reasons to be part of the trial. There are also some reasons why you should not participate in research. Don't participate in research to get rich, because you're not going to get rich. As a matter of fact, we're prohibited from paying people too much because we don't want to induce you to do a trial. It should be voluntary. We might give you funds to cover parking and certain expenses. Don't do it because your family, your partner, a friend thinks the study is a good idea for you. That's good, and you'd like support from others, but you should do it because you think it's a good idea and it's right for you. You can get people's advice, but it should be your decision. Don't do it because your doctor told you to join the study. Hopefully your doctor doesn't tell you to do that, but might ask you to. Don't do it because we asked. You shouldn't do it to make us feel good, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. Similarly, don't do it to please us or because you fear disappointing your physician team. They will be happy to take care of you whether you participate in the research or not. And don't do it because you think it's a magic cure for your disease. It may be a useful therapy, but remember, research is experimentation, and you need to know what you're getting into. So there are good reasons and not good reasons to participate in research. What are the different types of clinical research studies? There are a lot of different types of clinical research studies. I think people tend to mostly think about treatment trials, but there's really a lot of other studies that we do to better understand scleroderma that can lead to better treatments or better ways to take care of patients. We have registries. So registries are meaning that we collect information, we're signed up, and we sort of collect information, and we have a list of patients. This is very helpful to gate data over time. We do surveys, epidemiologic studies, where we may go out and survey patients at any one time or things. This is yet a different type of data collection. We do observational longitudinal studies, sometimes in the context of a registry, sometimes not. This means we're following people over time to collect information about how they're doing, how they're feeling, laboratory studies, etc. This isn't interventional, but we learn about the changes that happen in patients with scleroderma, for example, and we get a lot of useful information. We may collect biologic specimens. That could be blood, could be urine, it could be skin, pieces of skin through biopsy, it could be lots of different things, or DNA. We can get those things, we call those biological specimens. That can happen in the setting of an observational study or a clinical trial or something else. These different types of research aren't mutually exclusive. We might have a study to evaluate a new diagnostic tool. Can we better understand how to look for heart disease in patients with scleroderma? We might look at a new MRI. That may be a study of its own, and that's another type of clinical research study. And then, of course, there are therapeutic clinical trials. And this is what gets the most attention, but it's not the only type of research. These are trials that we're testing a new therapy or a new treatment or a new device to help treat, in this case, scleroderma, but it's true for all other diseases as well. And these can be open label, randomized, single arm trials. What do I mean by that? I'll talk a little bit about that later as well, but there are different designs of trials. And they could be drug trial or treatment trial or device trials. They could be a surgical approach. And they can be at one center or multi-center. And these are all different ways to design. And there are many different designs of clinical trials. One example that is very relevant is the CONQUER study. Now, the CONQUER study it stands for Collaborative National Quality and Efficacy Registry for Tracking Disease Progression in Systemic Sclerosis, which is another name for scleroderma. We call it CONQUER. This is a study sponsored and run by the Scleroderma Research Foundation, and our center and many others are part of this study. This study is multi-center, multiple studies, at least in the United States. It's a registry, so people are signed up, and we follow them over time. It's an observational study. We're watching patients over several years. And we're collecting lots of data from both doctors and patients, laboratory data, how you feel data, clinical information. We're recording that in the computer. We're also collecting biologic samples, and we're storing those. And through having all of this information in the CONQUER study, we're already being able to do lots of analyses and publish new information to understand this disease better. As I said, it's multi-center. Here are the centers that are involved in the United States. These are all generally major scleroderma programs. And this is what kind of research that we can do when we work together to study this rare disease. And we have hundreds of patients now in this trial. And again, it's sponsored by the Scleroderma Research Foundation. Another study you're going to hear about during this symposium is the CONQUEST study. And I will not go into detail just to raise it. the awareness that the Scleroderma Research Foundation is also sponsoring this, and this is an interventional study. This is a drug study for lung disease, and you're going to hear a lot more about it, but it's another type of study. Just to give you an example, even the SRF is doing more than one type of study, and that is very common. They sponsor other research as well. So you say, can I be enrolled in more than one study? The answer is yes, you can. We have patients who are enrolled in Conquer who are also in clinical trials. But you usually can't be in two treatment trials at the same time because that will mess up the experiment. But you can certainly be in an observational study and a treatment trial at the same time. Let's go over some of the terms that I've mentioned and some others. Randomization. So randomization in a clinical trial means that you are randomized to one treatment or another. It might be placebo, which is a fake treatment, or it could be active drug. But randomization is important because then we're not picking it based on factors that may influence the outcome. And usually this is now done by computer. Computer will take you and randomize you to one group or the other. Placebo. Placebo is an inactive drug. It could be so-called sugar pill. It could be intravenous that just has saline, but it's not an active drug. And the reason we use that is because we want to be able to compare active drug to an inactive drug. And everybody, all of us, can have a placebo response, meaning we might feel better just because we think we're getting something. So we often give some people placebo and some people not, so that you don't know what you're on and I don't know what you're on when we do the evaluation. So it's a bit more objective. Controlled means that there's a comparison. So if you're studying drug X, you want to have it against either another drug, so it's controlled, or placebo, or even more than one different arm. And so we control it so you can have some comparisons. Single blind, double blind. So then it can be open label. So blinding means you don't know what group you're in or what treatment you're getting. So single blind might mean that the patient doesn't know what he or she is getting, but the doctor does, or the other way around. Double blind means both the treating physician or nurse and the patient doesn't know what the patient is on. And that's the sort of the best way to do it, because then we're not biased by knowing what you may or may not be on, because we want these drugs to work. We want to make sure that we are not influencing our decisions about how well the drug is working. Open label means that everybody knows what's going on, and that may be appropriate for certain types of studies. It still can be very useful, especially when what you're measuring isn't going to be influenced by whether you know you're on something or not. Study drug, also called the investigational product. This is what you're actually studying. It could be something that's already available, or it could be a new drug that's not readily available outside of research. Or it could be a surgical procedure, or it could be a device, or it could be a method of relaxation, of therapy. It could be lots of things. Best medical judgment. That means sometimes patients are switched to that, which means we're still going to follow you in research, but you're getting whatever you and your doctor together feel is the right thing. Adverse events. Adverse events are just what they sound like, bad things that happen. These are generally medically adverse events, and sometimes they're called severe ones if you have to go in the hospital or have to get intravenous antibiotics or something like that. But we have to keep track of those because it could be a great treatment, but if it causes lots of adverse events, maybe it's not so great. So we have to measure those things as well. Serious adverse events are the ones that are more serious, often require a trip to the hospital. And protocol deviations, I want to mention this because a protocol is what you're actually studying, the rule book for how you study. It's the design of what you and the treating physician will follow. And it's important to follow the protocol because otherwise the science will get disturbed. And so if you don't follow it, that's called the protocol deviation. We try to avoid that. One time that's particularly common is if we have to do something different for your safety, we won't hesitate to do that, but it still might be a deviation. And finally, there's something called a drug and data and safety monitoring board. Most clinical trials have these, depending on the size. These are people separate from the investigators. These are a group of usually doctors, sometimes statisticians, who are separate from the investigators doing the trial. And they're looking at the data along the way, looking at the trial, making sure that we're doing it right. and making sure there are no things that should be brought to attention. Maybe there's a reason to stop the study, etc. It's a check on the whole system, and it's very good to have. We like having that. It's an objective way of looking at things. So we often talk about randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. Why are these considered the best? As opposed to, I have a new drug for someone's Raynaud's phenomenon, and I'm going to just give it to the next 20 people and see if it works. That is reasonable, and we can get information out about that. That's open label single arm, but it's not controlled, it's not randomized. Why are randomized controlled trials considered the best? Because, and they're certainly not the only way we study, but they are designed to prove a treatment works. It's the best study design because you're going up against another treatment and you're eliminating other problems. You avoid biases because if I don't know what you're on, or if you randomize people, it really helps the data become stronger for looking at whether or not the drug works. It's the most powerful method statistically, but it often requires more subjects than other types of studies, and that usually means it's more expensive and more complicated, but it's the best. And so when the FDA, for example, the United States Food and Drug Administration, wants to approve a drug for use, most of the time they will require at least one or two randomized controlled trials to be done. Not always, but most of the time, because they want the best evidence to prove it works and is safe for patients. These are usually performed, these randomized trials, after there have been some smaller studies that might demonstrate the safety and maybe some early efficacy. Efficacy meaning, does it work? So that's how you do these randomized trials. Usually they come after smaller studies. Whenever you join a study, whether it be an observational study or an interventional study or a treatment trial, you usually have to give informed consent. We should not be doing research on people unless they know what are being done. So informed consent means that you agree to be part of the study. But it's important to understand both of these words. You need to be informed. You need to know what you're getting into, and you need to agree to it. So it's a process by which potential subjects or patients learn about and agree to participate in research. That includes, why is the study being done? What is going to happen? How many visits? Do I have to give blood or not? Do I get tests? What's the schedule, etc.? What are the risks and what are the benefits of the study? This is the most important part of consent. Are there risks of the study drug? Are there risks of being part of things in the test? What might I benefit from and what might not? Who's running the study at that site and who's running it overall? What are the options? Do I have any other options? You always have options. You don't have to participate in the study. What other treatment options do you have? You should know about that. What will the cost be to you or others? Often there's no cost, but we have to outline it. You have to make sure you understand that your records will be private. We work very hard to make sure that's the case, but you need to understand the privacy of your information, which we work very hard to safeguard. This is called an informed consent form, and these are often long, even longer than this, and they can be complicated, and that's a problem because we're required to give lots of information. Signing these forms is required to be part of the study, so you need to read them and understand. I usually ask people to read them on their own. I'll come back in the room, answer any questions you might have, but they're complicated sometimes. So it's not just about reading and signing the form. More important is the conversation you have with the physician or nurse or whoever is running the trial with you. That's what informed consent really is. But they are long and you should know about them. So here's an example of a title page. This is the Conquer study we're running here. Dr. Sandorf is leading that at our center. And it's got all sorts of text. Here's one, 3 pages into 8. And it said, do you agree to have certain things collected in terms of the biopsy? And at the end of the 8 pages, you sign and I sign or whoever's consenting. And then you get a copy, etc. But it's the conversation that matters. Here's another example. This is a shorter consent form, but this is actually for an interventional trial. This patient is getting a drug. This is one nearby. And you'd be surprised what kind of patients have to be consented. And if you look at this carefully, I'll let you look at this. This is a study of a new drug for heart disease. But you can see it's actually done at our veterinary school. It's on dogs. And that is the patient. I'm allowed to share this because this is my assistant's dog. And and he was enrolled in a trial for heart disease, and he actually had to sign it. He let Kathleen sign for him, and so Pepe was a trial itself. And so even with our animals, we want to make sure that they know what's going in. I say this for fun, but it's the same concept. So she needed to understand what was Pepe going to be exposed to, etc. So she was informed and she consented to let it happen. Sometimes you do it in favor. So often parents have to consent for children, for example. So other things about informed consent, it's not just the paper form. The conversation is really much more important. Understand what you're doing and why it may or may not be good for you. You must understand the study and not just your family member or your friend. Take the time to read the form. Ask the questions that you need to ask. It's important. But some frequently asked questions. Why are consent forms longer than a Stephen King novel? They can be very long because they're required to outline everything. They include non-experimental parts. Every drug you may have has to be included in all the different things that could happen. So it can be a little confusing. That's why conversation is important to make you put it all into context. We have to put some standard legal language in, etc. What should I do with it? You should read it and don't sign it unless you understand it, and then you keep a copy of it, and we can go over it again. Why do I sometimes have to re-sign consent forms? People are in trials often for a long time. Every time there's a change in the protocol or we change the people who are doing the study or there's new information, we have a new version. And so sometimes they're very minor changes, sometimes they're more extensive, and sometimes we have you re-sign the form. So let's talk about the research team. Who do we work with? It's not just one person. It's often a group of people that are involved in doing our research. So who are they? Well, there's the principal investigator. That person, often a physician, but doesn't have to be. It can be a PhD, it can be a nurse. All sorts of people can be the principal investigator. And that's the person who is ultimately responsible for the research being done at that site. There may be a PI for each site, and there may be an overall PI for a multi-center study. But when I'm running a study, I'm responsible for what happens at the University of Pennsylvania. And if I'm running a trial internationally, which I have, I'm ultimately responsible for the overall study. You should know who that is. It may or may not be your doctor, co-investigators, or other investigators, doctors or nurses who are involved in being investigators in the trial. So I showed you that the CONQUER study, the principal investigator at the University of Pennsylvania is Dr. Sandorfi, but I'm also a co-investigator, as is Dr. Dirk. So we have principal investigator and co-investigators. There's a biostatistician, usually several in a big trial, but there's usually a lead biostatisticians that are involved, and they help understand how to analyze the data in the end, because that's very important. There's a project manager that may help run and the logistics of getting all the study stuff done. Study coordinators or study nurses are very important. You'll spend more time with them probably than with the physician. Those are the people that help collect the data, will help get you from one appointment to another, will be your point of contact. Very important to know who those are, and they help collect all the data and get things going. The clinic staff are important. The phlebotomy, the people who take blood, and lab staff, all of them can be involved in clinical research. There's often a safety officer somewhere else. I told you about the Data and Safety Monitoring Board that's monitoring in addition to everybody else. And I told you about the Data Safety Monitoring Board. And there may be a sponsor. So for CONQUER, the sponsor is the Scleroderma Research Foundation. For another study, it may be a drug company. For another study, it might be the National Institutes of Health. It's good to know who's sponsoring the study that you're part of. And then the most important part of the clinical research team is the patient. You are critical. And we are very appreciative and understand what you're giving us to be part of this trial. You are very much part of the team. And the patient advocacy groups, such as the Scleroderma Research Foundation or others, may be part of the research team as well. There may be others involved as well. It takes a village. It takes a lot of people to do proper research. So what should you ask? We already went over some of the things you should think about, but what are the costs and who pays for it? Most of the time, we'd like to have all of the costs so there's no cost to you to be part of a trial. Well, you should know. Some of the things are still charged to insurance. What do you pay for? Will you get reimbursed for certain things? Know what you're getting involved in. When does the study end? Why are some so long? We sometimes need long studies because scleroderma, for example, some of the changes take a long time, and we really need to see if something works by following it over months or sometimes even years. But you should know how long it is. Will you get study results? Well, we never give out study results almost never during the trial, because we're not allowed to know what's going on. We're blinded to the data as well. Eventually, you'll know what happens in the overall study, and you'll know what you were on. But it takes a long time before even we know as well. And so you should understand that. And then there are research things and non-research things that you may know about. Who will be your doctor, my doctor during the trial? Well, that's good to know. Sometimes it's the regular doctor you have, but they may or may not be part of the trial, or you may be referred in and then we'll take care. It's good to know who's going to take care of things, what happens at the end of the study, etc. And then what if you get sick or have complications? Well, I can guarantee you the most important thing always is patient safety and patient comfort. So that comes first, but there's usually a procedure for how we handle that in the middle of the trial. Can you drop out of a study? You always have the right to drop out of a study. However, don't join a study you think you're going to drop out of, because that doesn't help you and it doesn't help the science. We prefer people not drop out, but there's sometimes very good reasons. You get sick, other things happen, you move, things happen in your life. We understand that. But that's why it's good to know what you're getting into to try to minimize that. But of course you have the right to drop out of the study. Other questions? Why is there no research center near me? This often comes up. Why the centers not for this trial? Because not every trial can involve every center. Sometimes it requires specialization. There's a cost factor. So we understand that can be frustrating that you may live far from a research center. Sometimes we actually help pay for travel to get people to you, or forget you to get to us. People often ask, why are you studying my disease or my disease subtype or my problem or my ideas for treatment? Those are good questions. We actually get some of our best ideas from patients, but we can't study everything, especially in a rare disease. So sometimes we have to focus on what's the most common or what's the most important, or what do we think we can have the best impact on. Why don't I qualify for your study? Because we have rules for who can be in a study or not. Sometimes it's good to not qualify because it means you're not sick enough to qualify for a study. But we have to have guidelines because we have to ask the questions carefully. So we understand that people sometimes want to be in a trial, they don't qualify. And that's so we can do the science well. Why can't I just take the experimental medication without being in a study? Well, sometimes we do that, new drugs that we haven't yet proven. We like to avoid that. We call that empiric use. But we need to do study drugs in a controlled setting so we understand all about the safety and efficacy, and that's best done in the setting of a clinical trial. Why are you researchers so slow? It does take a while to do these trials. It takes a long time to recruit enough patients and get it done because we're trying to do it right. In a rare disease, it just takes longer. Why do you take so much blood? Well, we often want to get safety information. Often it's not as much blood as you think, but it looks like a lot with the tubes. And we often do additional studies in science with it so we can study and learn as much as possible. My disease is not active. Can I still be in a research study? Maybe. It depends on the nature of the trial. And then here's a couple more points. Why are so many studies negative, and do they really help? Well, we obviously rather have positive studies that lead to new drugs. But some drugs don't work, but some do. We need to know that. If we knew they worked ahead of time, we wouldn't need to do the studies. Negative studies are still very helpful. We stop using that drug, we stop pursuing it, and we can put our resources elsewhere. Positive studies are better, but they're both important. And the same thing involves to non-drug experiments. A lot of good research still comes out of these negative studies. We learn more about the disease. So just to end us, what are your expectations regarding research? Well, you need to really understand reality of what you're getting into. Research is exciting and great, but it has its limits. So I think I've seen over the years a big range of what patients are thinking before they join a trial. Some patients think it's this, that they're, oh my God, I'm jumping off the cliff. It's very risky. And some patients think it's this, that it's fantastic, and I'm going to get the cure. I think the reality for everybody is really in between. These are important things to do, but you need to know what you're getting into, and they really help us advance care. So remember, research isn't treatment itself. Research is an experiment, but that is how we advance our work. How do you find out information about clinical research in scleroderma? Well, there are a lot of sources, but I think a very good one is something called clinicaltrials.gov, a website run by the United States government. We were required to put our trials on there. And you can just I put in the word scleroderma here. You can see there in the middle. And immediately I get 553 studies. You can actually do many other filters and get it down. And they list studies that are open or closed and whether or not there's a center near you. So to summarize, clinical trials are important ways we advance medical knowledge and improve treatment. We want the right trial, the right patient at the right time. Clinical trials are critical for us advancing our care and helping, and we really appreciate that our patients consider whether to be part of our research. And if you join, that's great. And if it's not right for you, that's fine too. But we want to be able to continue to make significant progress to help us treat this disease better and cure it. That's our ultimate goal. So I'm happy to stop here, and I think there'll be a session where I can take some questions. Thanks very much for your attention.